You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. You're listening to Rashkin Report. You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. On this program, I'm excited to welcome back Maria Snegovaya, who's a PhD candidate in comparative politics and statistical methods at Columbia University, and is also a columnist for Vedomosti, and her work's been published all over the place, including Newsweek.com. And, Maria, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for the invite again, Yuri.
Well, I guess let's begin with your look at 2016. You published in January 7th, I'm seeing the date, Center on Global Interests, and you wrote that the headline is Russia's worsening economy means less aggression abroad, more repression at home in 2016, which is kind of a preview of what the year is going to look like. We're not even halfway through, but how do you feel your predictions and outlook is faring so far?
Oh, I actually believe that my predictions were quite spot on, although I wouldn't really take too much credit for them because they were not really, so that unexpected. I mean, everything that I've been saying there was kind of clear from and easily visible from previous actions by the Kremlin, so you could easily imagine what was going to happen next. So I assume that in light of continuously worsening economic situation, the regime will face two challenges. At the same time, people will be less interested in, this aggression abroad because, it's great to be a big power when you have money in your wallet. But when you don't have any money in your wallet, it's actually at some point you just want to eat. And that's what you care about. And that's exactly what we observe over the sociological surveys that all start showing that right now the interest of the Russians has been switching towards refocusing from the international agenda towards their domestic agenda. And simultaneously, the regime will have an increased urge to mobilize the support, right? So it will be increasingly in demand of mobilizing the support of the population in light of the upcoming elections and in light of the worsening economic situation, while it can no longer use the international agenda as successfully as it did in case of, say, Crimea annexation in 2014. And then I reasoned that means that the focus will shift from the international agenda towards domestic agenda, and the regime will try two things simultaneously: repress the opposition and find scapegoats, probably also scapegoating the opposition, in order to explain to the people, explain to its voters why things are not going the way they're supposed to be. So that's what I expected, that's what I predicted, and I feel like my predictions were correct.
And I think you're absolutely right. This is the direction that it is going, and the fact that outside wars in Syria, for instance, maybe, according to Putin, no more expensive than military exercises, it still just didn't seem to actually work well for Russia on political level and other things. I don't know that do you feel that much was accomplished with this external war, the Syria excursion?
Well, from my perspective, at least, let's put this way. A month ago, I would have said yes. At this moment, I'm no longer certain because as the ceasefire in Syria keeps basically basically suspicions arise that the ceasefire in Syria will not hold. There is this deepening kind of divide in between the analysts regarding what Russia may do next, and so that kind of will alternate our conclusions, our early conclusions about Putin's incursion into Syria.
So are you saying that Russia may not be done with Syria yet?
Yeah, that's what analysts increasingly have been pointing out recently. It's not very clear what exactly Moscow's strategy there is for now, but it's pretty clear that Russia has not totally left Syria. It definitely preserved a lot of...
Do you think there's a similarity between the first, between Syria and Ukraine in a sense of the hybrid war, an approach to a hybrid war, and we'll discuss that a little bit in a second. But the idea that you make these agreements and you announce that you're leaving and you say your armies are no longer there, but in essence you're still there and you're still doing what you need to do, you're just buying yourself more time. And that's what happened between the between the first and second Minsk agreements. After the second one, they seem to have actually, those sort of took, but even there, that continues. There's still people are dying in Ukraine, and seems to be the same ideas in Syria, where you have announcement that we're going to leave, and then, as you point out, it's still there.
Oh, yes, precisely. That's the Moscow's approach. That's very common. I don't know if that's specifically something you want to call a hybrid war or not, because we had the whole big full-fledged debate on this topic with some analysts who disagree with the fact that with this term, with calling this particular behavior hybrid war, but the fact that Russia has been using very similar approaches all over the place, it's definitely true. Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that in general, though, if you look at the Syria adventure as it seemed to us, say, a month ago, that seemed to be a more or less successful approach. Russia unexpectedly, as usual, unexpectedly for the United States, unexpectedly for the rest of the Western countries, moved into Syria, strengthened Assad, while actually doing the things that were different from what actually it claimed it was doing, because we know that, if anything, Russia was bombing everyone but ISIS, and it claimed it was bombing ISIS. But nonetheless, it did succeed in strengthening Bashar Assad, did succeed in imposing its agenda on the United States approach, because we did see that the rhetoric of the U.S. officials shifted from insisting that Assad must have left immediately to saying that maybe Assad will leave at some point, but for now, right, it's important that he stays there and assists in negotiation process and whatnot. So that is all the achievement that Moscow has been able to do, and ultimately it did succeed, and it's at least partially in imposing certain kind of ceasefire that was unthinkable before, right? So at least a month ago, it seemed like a quick success, and moving out was a really good idea at that point, because if anything, you wanted to move out before ceasefire was about to erode. But once again, at that point, it seemed a very successful approach. In Russia, definitely is perceived as a success. However, as I said, Russians are generally at the moment seem to be way less interested in foreign policy agenda compared to what they used to be. So it is a success, but whether Putin is achieving his domestic goals with that success is a different question, and I hope we can discuss it a little bit later.
Well, absolutely. Since the conversation we shifted to Syria and the idea of hybrid war, you said that this is a big discussion. Do you, the idea is that rather than just declaring a war, on those that are not familiar with the term or the conversation, is that rather than just declare war, you kind of pretend like you're involved. You have information war. Your media is at war seemingly, and you talk about maybe even some military victories, but in reality, very little is going on, just enough to continue to destabilize the situation. And you're saying
it is true, yeah. Just there are some military analysts who say that, first of all, covert operations or like use of unconventional methods in military warfare, all these techniques have been used for a while. Before the very concept of Russia's hybrid warfare was in place. And if anything, the hybrid warfare, as it is defined by military, like very specific military analysts, means something else. But in general, in the Russian analysis, like hybrid warfare term, this term has been used pretty broadly, right? And as I argued in my own research that I did for the Institute for Study of War last September, the majority of the techniques that Russia implements and that fall under the definition of the hybrid warfare, they can hardly be called new ones, right? At the same time, I do feel, and it seems, and I like the majority of Russian analysts share this perception that Russia has been increasingly kind of making a choice to avoid a covert operation and use of unconventional techniques in order to promote its interests abroad. I, in particular, am really interested in its use of propaganda and various media outlets that are usually used to back its viewpoints that Russia prefers, or in order to create more noise in the certain information environment, etc., etc. All these things are being utilized by Russia. All these strategies are being approaches are utilized by Russia increasingly, and we've seen that in Ukraine. And part of them, as you've mentioned, they partly been also utilized in Syria. Whether you want to call it a hybrid warfare or maybe come up with some other term, is different approaches. There's a lot of different arguments made by different analysts, as I mentioned, regarding how it may be. Which term?
What is the appropriate way to describe in a military analyst term what Russia is doing then?
No, some people some military analysts still believe the hybrid warfare is a good approach, a good term to use to describe it. So other people use ambiguous warfare, non-linear warfare, but I would just propose that we leave this kind of definitional discussion to military experts, to whom these are like definitions between ambiguous, non-linear.
I agree and disagree at the same time, because I completely agree. Whatever you want to call it, it doesn't change what it is. But at the same time, Absolutely. How do we call it so that we could have a reference to it? In my opinion, it actually is it's a fake war. It's a lot of faking, and I think that seems to have been like an approach that Putin regime has taken to so many different things, including their domestic policy. When they just fake, they fake through things. They fake through wars. They fake through international policy with these very day-to-day interests and surprises. But it's not. It's not a real war. So I think calling it hybrid is almost giving it too much credit. It's it kind of makes it seem like a powerful operation, and they're just faking it.
Well, I don't think that people, Ukrainians in Donbass, Luhansk,
I thought you were going to say that. Correct. There are people dying, and that it's horrible, it's disturbing, and it's not right. And the fact that, in my opinion, the regime is using such overpowering lethal methods, because it seems to be the only thing they're good at is producing ammunition. People are dying, but it's not a real war with invasion, because maybe the Russian army is fake.
That's very true. This is true, absolutely true. And the reason why Gerasimov, actually the head of Russian army, has even announced, so basically the term hybrid warfare stems from an interview by Gerasimov that he gave to one of the Russian media outlets, where he outlined the basic concept of this nonlinear hybrid warfare. And there he specifically underlines the fact that this approach is kind of out of the weakness approach, in that you're forced to use in the situation where you cannot use a full-fledged regular, army forces. And he doesn't say that, but he kind of can imply that, partly because they're just not there. And there was several reports by different Western analysts and army officers who served or somehow assisted Ukrainians in the fight, and they would all suggest that the organization of the separatists haven't been strong. And we also know that the Russia's military in general, the army of Russia in general is much to be desired. Even if they're trying to restructure it and they achieve certain kind of success, in general, Russia just doesn't have enough military capacity to run a lot of efficient warfares. So it's forced to use these hybrid techniques.
You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. My guest is Maria Snegovaya, a scholar at Columbia University, and we're speaking about 2016 as it is shaping for Russia, and we began by talking about foreign policy and the concept of, perhaps rightly, perhaps not quite, the so-called hybrid war, and what does it say about the approach that Russia has to dealing with external problems. Now, shifting the focus to internal situation, there's elections coming up, supposedly. There's, like a Russian Congress, or Duma, that is there, and yet any member of, I guess, so-called opposition that is in, let's just say opposition is under attack in one way or another. It may not be lethal, since last year Boris Nemtsov was killed, but people are being made provocative movies about, featuring some kind of nefarious Photoshop potentially evidence to showcase people as not opposition leaders but American spies, and saying all sorts of bad things about other opposition members. Maria, why do you feel that Putin's regime has taken such an active approach at attacking the weak opposition?
So several explanations. As I mentioned before, we are in the situation in Russia where the economic crisis is deepening, the economic situation is worsening, people's income have been declining for the first time, actually, so seriously in the last years, for the first time, actually, in most of Putin's rule. Even in 2008, crisis didn't have such a long-term impact on people's real incomes. And we also see that for the first time again, Putin's rule, people start spending over half of their incomes on food, which means that they're actually getting much poorer than they used to be. Simultaneously, we also observe that's the information available through the social surveys and other data, like different independent analysis, is that people are increasingly unhappy about the current situation, and their focus shifts from geopolitical victories of Russia towards domestic agenda. And of course, part of that part of this shift is detrimental for the authorities, for the Kremlin, because people start blaming Russian authorities for the way things are with the economic situation in the country. We've seen that the subjective index of economic well-being has been declining since fall 2015, and in turn, as usually happens in Russia, it drew the decline in Putin's own rating that remained at very stable, very high level for the last year and a half since Russia incursed in Ukraine and annexed Crimea. So we see that actually, and of course not only Putin's rating, but also other, as usually again, Putin's rating is strongly correlated with every other indexes of support of the Russian authorities and certain Russian political institutions, including Duma, trust in politicians and whatnot. So all these other indexes are slightly going down, which is of course not very good news for Kremlin in light of the upcoming elections in September. And in a situation like that, what do you do? Usually you try to mobilize the support of the population. But what are the approaches to use in this situation? You could, again, try another little successful warfare somewhere, I don't know, maybe in Latin America. What are the other continents that Putin has not yet didn't have any kind of military operation at? But as I said, Russians don't want that anymore, since in their rankings of their priorities right now, the economic considerations are at the top. So the alternative approach would be to find a scapegoat within the country and to prosecute this. Basically, the bad person or the bad group of people, the fifth column, that is responsible for all the problems with the system, right? So Bastrykin's article, where he enumerates more prohibitive measures, has partly to do with the fact that you need to find somebody who's responsible for these troubles and to shift the responsibility from the authorities towards these bad people, right? At the same time, it's also true that they cannot just shift this focus, because people are not completely stupid, right? As Obama called Putin. So the other approach is just to repress any kind of dissent in order to spread fear, and so that there's just no place for this dissatisfaction because people are too scared to reveal it. So these are like two goals that this article by Bastrykin is trying to achieve.
Let's talk about the article and introduce Mr. Bastrykin, who may not be familiar to American audiences, but he is the chair of the Investigative Committee of Russian Federation, so kind of like Investigator General. And because of the way Russian justice system is set up, there is a position called Investigator General. I don't know if there's a better translation, but that's what I'm going with. And Mr. Bastrykin penned this editorial saying that the information war that is being led by America against Russia calls for actionable defense methods. We have to kind of step it up. And it really seems to have just sent shockwaves throughout Russian society, because it really, not only is Mr. Bastrykin himself, General Bastrykin, appears to be violating Russian constitution that now, nobody officially cares about anymore, and that seems to be a fact that is only acknowledged by people who oppose the government, but also it's just very kind of reminds people, I think, of Stalin and the wording that was used by his henchmen, calling for these cleansings that led to millions of people eventually being murdered. So what are your thoughts?
First of all, I totally agree on your characterization of this article by Bastrykin. That's definitely written in a very unpleasant style that reminds people really the Stalin's period, or at least the Soviet period. But it's hardly a new development per se, because these kind of articles have been widespread in Russian media. One of the most influential ones was published by Izvestia, which is also a pro-Kremlin, which is a pro-Kremlin publication, and basically the article demanded to strengthen the repressions against Russia's fifth column, which is the Russian opposition. So from this perspective, Bastrykin's article is not completely new. The new part is the new element to this piece is, as you mentioned, the position of the writer. Bastrykin is a high level official in the Kremlin system, and he is said to be connected to the Kremlin, to the top of the Kremlin. So you cannot just ignore it. At the same time, the article was published not by traditional pro-Kremlin publications such as Izvestia, but this time by Kommersant Vlast. And Kommersant is a previously completely independent publication. Right now, it's kind of half and half, but usually it's something that is read widely by the Russian public and considered to be more or less independent. So the fact that Bastrykin chose Kommersant Vlast to publish his article suggests that he wanted this article to be widespread, read very widely by very different groups of population, including the opposition. And many people assume that this might mean, especially the place of the publication, might suggest that this is a program of action that the Russian officials are planning to take in the near future. which in my opinion is a very plausible assumption given the previous reason, all these previous arguments that I made. The regime is increasingly scared of its ability and uncertain about its ability to successfully gain the same level of support in the upcoming elections. There is also increasing kind of protest propensity among the population, and people are increasingly disappointed with the economic situation in the country. This is the situation where you would expect some of the regime's paranoia to translate into a certain kind of repressive action. So this is very plausible.
All right, then. Well, what you just said, I think, points to what I've been seeing myself, and that is that there's the major point of the discussion is this article by General Bastrikin something to be taken seriously or not? And I think the optimists in Russian media seem to be saying that, oh no, he's really not influential. He's just, maybe this is some kind of a inter-Kremlin war between different factions, and he says things, and maybe he'll be even demoted. Who knows? Maybe this is the sign of the end for him. And yet others are saying that, I think, and I agree with your point on this, is that this could very easily be a real signal that could lead to real changes and a further, tightening of the screws. Do you feel that, what's going to happen? Yeah. Where could this go?
Actually, I would back my opinion by the fact that Bastrikin article does not exist in the void. We did observe previous development that also play into the same kind of idea of deepening of increasing repressions within Russia. For example, the recent announcement by Vladimir Putin regarding the creation of the so-called National Guard, right, which is basically the army that will be used only for domestic will only be applied for domestic reasons, for like issues within the country, will not be used abroad, and whose head is Putin himself, right? So some people say that the creation of this National Guard has to do with trying to get the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov under control, which is part of the story, I believe. But
because he has his own army in Chechnya, so this kind of is a counter option to that. Plus, doesn't it also incorporate his army into it?
Yeah, precisely. National Guard will incorporate into it all the regional armies that are currently not as hierarchically.
What are the chances, do you think, that a Chechen army will follow leader of Kremlin when their loyalties to Kadyrov?
Yeah, I don't think actually that, given on what we know about Chechnya and its organization, I don't think that the chances of success are that big, to be honest. But I do believe that at least one of the reasons why the National Guard has been launched is to try to get Chechnya under control and maybe also learn, from the experience that Kadyrov has in suppressing all the dissent within his own region, Chechnya, which we know is very kind of extremely well-behaving in the sense that Kadyrov has been able to eliminate any public dissent and by imposing this environment of fear and harsh persecution in his own region. So we do also know that in an attempt to persuade Kadyrov to leave his current position in Chechnya, he was offered actually to head a structure similar to the National Guard during the private discussions with Putin. These are the rumors, but they're very plausible. So this National Guard army could have potential also incorporate Kadyrov's experience in order to spread this experience over the regions of Russia to ensure loyalty and obedience of the Russian population. So we've been saying that the National Guard, definitely the creation of this National Guard plays into this increasingly repressive environment within the country. And ultimately, of course, also the recent appointment of the, correct me if I'm wrong, the new Commissioner for Human Rights.
Absolutely, who is like a police general or something like that.
who is today was the new appointment was announced, and the new commissioner for human rights will be the lady, a woman who was previously ahead of basically worked and one of the heads of one of the departments within the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Russia. So you could imagine what her attitudes towards human rights is. So all these new developments kind of point toward the same conclusion, that the regime realizes these risks and threats that it's facing, which is true, that the risks to its survival are increasing because people are increasingly disappointed about the way Putin rules the country, and it tries to strengthen its hold on power by increasing its monopoly on violence. That is basically manifested through different means, including the recent article by Bastrykin.
You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. We're speaking with Maria Snegovaya, a scholar at Columbia University, about what is 2016 shaping so far to be in Russia. We covered the external, the internal, and the politics, and really the one connector for all of this that I'd like to touch on as the last subject of our conversation is the role of media in all of this, because it seems that media in Russia has been that vital part, possibly stronger than the military, at least so far, in molding the mindset of Russian people, as well as getting the Kremlin's point of view out into the world. And it's certainly been quite effective. Maria, what do you think about it?
There's been a lot of discussion among the Western analysts whether the Russia's propaganda campaign has been successful abroad. But where all of the experts in Russia agree is that, if anything, within the country itself, this propaganda campaign of the Russian regime has been extremely successful. So you see that, first of all, majority of the Russian public TV channels and public media are owned in one way or another by people, institutions that are loyal to the regime. And we also know that about 90% of Russians use TV channels as their primary source of news. There's a lot of Russians who, for example, go online and use internet too, but the primary source of news for all of them is the public TV channels, which are predominantly owned by pro-Kremlin institutions and people. So what this means is that, in general, the Kremlin has almost complete control over basically how people in Russia view the world. And multiple surveys and research shows that, if anything, the Kremlin has been able to craft a worldview in the minds of the Russians that's very different from how, say, an ordinary American perceives the reality. And unfortunately, we just discussed Bastrykin's last article, where he, for example, very boldly claims that pretty much every single development that's negative for Russia in the world is in one way or another has been instrumented by the United States, right? Unfortunately, that's, and we have discussed this before, is in general the perception of the Russian elites. And this is a perception that the Russian elites have been successfully able to impose on the Russians in general through the public TV media. The ownership of the media also allows the Kremlin to ensure continuous support for its actions abroad. There's multiple surveys, and I've published about that too, that reveal that the perceptions of the Russians about a need to launch a new military campaign, be it Ukraine or Syria, changed and fluctuate very quickly depending on what kind of message they're communicated by TV channels. So, for example, in September 2015, the majority of the Russians were against Russia's military action in Syria, and they were afraid that unpleasant comparisons with Afghanistan will be made. Afghanistan is a big failure of the Soviet army, and they didn't want to engage in the region again. And yet, right after Putin started the Syria campaign in the end of September. Several weeks later, in October 2015, most of the Russians, actually the same 60%, already approved of that military campaign. That's clearly doing of the public TV channels that are very successful in shaping the perceptions of the Russian population.
It almost, I think, is puzzling to people in the West to see a population of a country just be able to change their mind on a dime about pretty fundamental things. And yet, I completely agree with you. What is the view of Russian population towards this Bastrikin's approach and this general call for greater repressions? Are people saying, yes, let's do it? Are they hesitant? What are your thoughts?
So, one important comment to what you just said is that given this fluctuation in the sharp fluctuations in the Russian public opinion as they're measured by the surveys, some sociologists actually make a claim that these surveys may not necessarily be what you think they are, right? So these Russian surveys do not reflect what they reflect in the United States, for example, when, say, the majority of the American citizens approve of certain public initiative. Basically, that's what it is. They do approve of it. In the case of Russia, when people are not given a majority of different viewpoints, generally they are only communicated one, quote-unquote, correct viewpoint through the public TV channels. And the results that we see in the surveys might be really just a restatement of the opinion of the public TV channel. So people don't have the ability to think through, to analyze different viewpoints and to shape their own opinion. So what they end up pretty much repeating what they're said by TV channels rather than voicing their own opinions on it. In a way, it's a good news for, say, Russia's opposition, right? If the majority of the Russians, say, dislike the United States right now because they've been told so through Russia's public TV channels, given this fluctuation in their opinions, it is also true that if, say, Navalny, the leader of Russia's opposition, comes to power, he's been able to reshape these viewpoints in an opposite way. Right. So if Russians voice certain opinion, it doesn't necessarily mean that they deeply agree with that opinion. It mostly means that they repeat what they've been told by TV channels. And I'm afraid I forgot the second question that you asked. Could you please repeat it?
Well, I guess I'm trying to figure out what is the level of support within the Russian population to possible mass repressions.
Yeah. Unfortunately, so many sociologists say again that, so for example, Denis Volkov from Levada Center say that, very roughly, you can subgroup Russian population into three groups. So there's a little tiny share of the so-called liberals, pro-Western people who don't like the way things are in Russia. And according to different surveys, they are from 10 to 15% of the population. There is over 60% of so-called swamp. These are people who, as I said, mostly repeat what they're told by TV channels, but they don't have very strong opinions on certain issues. So these are people whose perceptions can be shaped easily depending who is in control of the public media. And there's also 20% of the so-called hawks. These are people with very strong Soviet-like attitudes. They really dislike the West. They really want Russia to be strong again, to be strong and powerful, and to be able to kick back the United States.
And that sounds like the military elites that you've written about in the past.
Yeah, precisely. And these are people, partly people with particular backgrounds. So unfortunately, these are also people who are at the top of Russia's decision making right now, and that's partly why we are right now where we are in our relationships with the United States. But in general, what they suggest is that there's 20% of the Russian hawks will definitely approve of Bastrikin's article and say he's right and maybe he's really way too soft He didn't mention that. He didn't mention, the certain kind of harsher prosecution for certain bad elements. So they definitely approve of it. And then you have also this swamp territory. These people who will probably support the article because that's what they're basically communicated by TV channels, and you can be guaranteed that on the state TV channels, that's predominantly the kind of message you get is very close to the message of Bastrykhin article. That is basically this very deleterious element within the country has been trying to destroy it from within, and that's why in these difficult times it's important to mobilize against them and basically go through certain kind of increased repressions in order to get rid of those bad elements. So the majority, basically the point being is that the majority approves, but for different reasons. And yet there's still definitely opposition elements, the liberal elements who disagree. These are people on my Facebook, who really are enraged by the recent message in the Bastrykhin's article. Unfortunately, they don't have the power at this point to change the direction of the country.
Right. As Mr. Shenderovich said, those people are the marginals right now in Russian society.
Yes, those people are traditional the marginals in the Russian society.
True as well.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Ms. Snegovaya, thank you so much for being on the program. In conclusion, what are your thoughts on when are the repressions going to start, and are we going to see them? Any sort of predictions, and how are we going to know that they're happening? Is there going to be mass arrests? Is there going to be what could happen?
So we know that usually the regime threatens more than actually does, right? So usually, I have no doubt
that
the repressions
faking it again?
No. Well, it's partly true, but not entirely, right? They'll definitely promising more than they can achieve, because in order to instrument mass repressions, you need a huge and very expensive mass repression apparatus. We've mentioned the National Guard before, right? Mm-hmm. Which might partly have that purpose in mind, but the regime just doesn't have the resources and the efficiency to implement that kind of that scale of repressions. Don't forget that Russia's regime ultimately is extremely inefficient, right? No matter how hard it tries, even the Russian army is in a horrible position, right? And only able to use very few military units for active operations out of it. So basically that's representative of the general state of Russian regime efficiency. So even if they want probably to prosecute a lot of people, they just can't do so. But we'll definitely observe more threats, more repressions against the opposition of Russia, against people who are trying to run against the Kremlin in the elections in the near future. But I'll still remain positive in the sense that Russia is a modernizing society, and it's really hard to fight against history, because the Russian system is fighting ultimately not against the so-called fifth column or, the opposition in Russia. It's fighting against history. Today's world and in general modernizing society ultimately realize that any successful development means a necessity to establish democracy, free elections, and rule of law. And Russians, I'm absolutely confident, will ultimately understand that. So from this perspective, any kind of attempts of the current Russian regime to stop the history are limited. But unfortunately, we'll have to wait a little bit longer until the system will realize that.
Maria Snegovaya, on that optimistic note, why don't we stop this conversation while it's so optimistic? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. You're listening to Rashkin Report.